Hi guys, my name is Borrodante. Today let's talk about one of your questions that has been hanging in my notes for quite a while: skin tones, or better put, how to render skin. A lot of the times this question actually sounds like, what are the skin tones you use? And I feel like it usually comes from the group of artists who aren't very experienced in actual rendering. They are mostly like drawing. And when you don't really pay attention to the whole science of rendering, you try to just simplify the whole rendering thing to just memorizing some colors and then applying them always the same way. On the internet, I quite frequently stumble upon the kind of pictures, you know, when they show this kind of thing where they like showing these circles, what kind of colors they used for the skin next to the drawing that has colors on it. And most of the times I can't really understand what kind of value do these circles bring. From my point of view, the only circles you can use for a character is not the circles of shading of the skin, but just circles of maybe colors of the skin, meaning the color of an actual texture. Like my skin is white, pale, kind of slightly pinkish. It has no yellow in it. I'm very pale. So the main circle would be kind of like it's close to red, I guess, not too much into yellow, and really bright like this. So I would use this kind of color for just main skin areas. But as you can see right now, I'm actually intentionally not wearing any skin foundation or anything. So you can see how the skin around my eyes is a lot darker. So that's another fundamental color for the skin. This is the area where my skin gets a lot thinner, so you can see a lot of kind of meat showing through. So basically that color will go darker, not more saturated, darker, and even closer to red. So that would mostly be, well, maybe a little bit more red. This would be the color of the skin around my eyes. Then we would have the color of the lips, for instance. Again, grabbing the main color and going a little bit darker, a little bit more saturated, and closer to red. So that would be probably the color of the lips. So these would be the main three colors on my face, maybe not considering some bad skin areas, maybe not considering my hands where the skin is generally a bit more yellow because the skin, like on the knuckles, the skin is a lot more rough, so it gets a bit more yellow, and in here it gets more red. But again, in some areas where the skin has to deal with a lot of friction, as I do on the table, it will go also more yellow on top of it being red, so colors vary throughout the whole body a lot. Also, a general classic approach to the skin color on the face actually go, if this is the basic color, the forehead area would actually be more yellow, the nose, eyes area is more red, and the bottom part, if I wouldn't have a beard, it would be more green-blue. Well, kind of green. So closer to green and less saturated, because that's how color circle works. So this is the classical formula for how to colorize a human face. They look very extreme, and this looks like some kind of flag, but if you have this as a base and then build on top of it, you will actually end up having a good expressive painting of a face. Probably mostly works for men, because greenish chin, that means that you shaved your face and some of the hairs showing up from under the skin, making it look a bit desaturated. That's mostly because in classical paintings, when they painted a woman, she would usually have like a super white skin like everywhere with blushy red areas on the cheeks. So the whole thing would be more like this. And with this. But if we forget about all the classical approaches and their specific choices, we would end up just studying a bunch of different races, ages, or how tan would change the color of the skin, how a mood or a condition of a person would change the skin. If someone's embarrassed or angry, the skin will be a lot more red. If you're cold or sick, you will be really pale, and I'm always sick apparently. So really, on this set of pictures, you can see how the photographer, or a designer, I don't remember, they chose just the main actual color of the skin of different people. And this is one color that you should start with. But as actual artists, actual painters, or drawers, we have to remember that these pictures are taken in perfect white light. So if, say, all these people would be standing not in the white light but in the sunlight, all their skin colors would go more like this. Or if it's winter and very cloudy outside, their skin colors would be more like this. So we have to deal with the constantly changing conditions, not only of the person but also of the environment. And all that is only if we're talking about the actual flat color of the skin, without considering shadows, translucency, highlights, etc. So already the basic color of the texture of the skin will change a lot to begin with. So for example, let's look at these 4 people with a color picker. So we'll start with the main light area on this woman over here at the bottom, and looking at the color wheel, I'll go upwards to the darker area of the forehead. You can see we go darker, more saturated, and more red. So all 3 dimensions of the color changing in this direction. Now let's choose this guy at the bottom left. He has a very pink skin color. Now the highlight is almost completely white because this is just a generic reflection of the light source, which is probably a white softbox. The same thing you see on my head right here. This is not an actual light. This is the reflection of the light box that's over there. So in here we're super pale and close to white, but skin color appears somewhere around here where we avoid the highlight. And now I'll go darker and we'll see a very familiar tendency of the color going darker, more saturated, and even more red. Or not really, this guy is initially very red, so not a lot of change there. Now on the guy on the top right, let's start from here. This seems to be a very bright area. And going darker, we moved a little bit closer to red, and also darker and more saturated. And now for an interesting example of the black skin. It's interesting because following the rule of changing the color from light to dark has generally the same effect, but you'll notice a much higher contrast. And in the shadow, we'll go even desaturated quite a lot. And this interesting change is explained very simply due to the fact that the color of the surface, the main basic color, this color, is a lot darker. The skin reveals a lot more of reflection. This is how basic physics of light reflection works. When the object is really light, you can see a lot less reflections on it. And if the surface is a lot darker, you can see almost everything reflected on it. So that's why most of these changes of color in here are basically different reflections. Here we obviously see a highlight. It's a very cool highlight, and here we can see like a blue color. We go to magenta, but this is really not the skin color already. And in front, of course, a very desaturated and very bright highlight from the white softbox in the front. So generally in this case, the change of the color goes a bit different. We have a saturated, normally lit skin right here. This is the brightest as the skin goes without catching an actual highlight where it will get desaturated and we'll just see a mixture of the skin color and the light source color. So this is normally saturated, this is the skin color, and as we go darker, the skin becomes so dark that mostly reflections dominate so much over the brightness of the skin that we mostly see just different colors of the reflectant lights from the environment. So actually black skin is very interesting to paint. It looks a lot more dynamic and has a lot more expressive variety. Also, I found just a few more examples of a dramatic lighting where we can see how, well, in this case we can see quite a lot of color correction, so there will be all kinds of colors in here, but generally the light is blue a little bit on the edges, so we have all kinds of changes in here, and none of these colors right here will actually apply. The whole head is just blue and magenta. And in this case, we can see a very noticeable difference of the highlights from the main light source, the white light from here, and a cold light from the top back. So in here, the skin is actually going blue. So the colors jump back and forth. And if we would try to actually memorize all these color circles for the skin, we would end up with like the half of the color wheel on our canvas to actually be able to paint something realistic. So I would compare the approach of learning skin rendering with memorizing skin tones like this to learning just silhouettes of the body. You won't be able to go further than a basic cartoon style with that kind of approach if you learn anatomy this way. To learn anatomy, you have to actually think in 3 dimensions and memorize proportions and actually see through just the color spot that you see and understand what's going on underneath. Same way with the color, you have to think in 3 dimensions: hue, saturation, and brightness. And applying kind of like what we do with memorizing proportions in anatomy, we memorize directions of change for colors. So if this is the basic color of the skin of the character we want to paint, first we need to think about what kind of condition this character is in. So if they're in the skylight situation, they will have warmer lit areas and colder semi-shadow areas where there's only skylight without the sun. So that means we'll make the skin more saturated and closer to yellow in the sunlight, because whenever the color of the object is close to the color of the light source, that object becomes more saturated in that light. A warm skin color will become more saturated in warm sunlight, and a bit colder and less saturated in the shadow area. So already in this basic environment lighting of the sun plus sky, we have quite a complex situation where on one side we will have a warm light and on the other side we'll have a cold light. Now, as we defined all the main lighting situations, we can move on and work with the shading using the same changes that we saw in these examples, where the skin color goes from its initial color to more saturated, dark, and closer to red in the shadow. And that is just a basic effect of the translucency. Well, not super basic, because we're not talking about a wax material, for example, where if the main color of some kind of candle would be this, in the shadow it will go more saturated as it goes darker, kind of like this, and showing this very saturated middle area right here as we see a lot of light bouncing inside of this material and showing up from underneath before the candle actually goes dark somewhere. With a human skin, we have a bit of a more complex situation, because on top we have the skin that is actually yellow, and underneath we have a lot of meat. So when the light is bouncing from underneath with the whole translucency action, it actually grabs the color of the skin, then it grabs a lot of the color of the meat, and then again a bit more color of the skin, and showing up in the end, showing quite a noticeable change towards the red color because of the blood under the skin. That's why in the main area we will have just the normal skin color, but as it goes darker on the edge, we'll see quite a lot of blood showing through. But all that science geometry aside, basically what we do with any skin ever, excluding the situation with the reflection, we go darker, more saturated, and closer to red. We don't think with this color and this color. We think with the directions of the change from the basic color. Always memorize the direction of the change. Don't memorize the collections of the circles, because they will change in different situations. Now let's move the color just closer to white and add a little highlight on the forehead, on the nose, maybe a little bit on the ear as well. And now let's give it a try in shading on the colder side of the face. So in here, I added a bit of a darker area in the middle to increase the contrast from the sunlight, because sun is a lot brighter than the sky, so we can play around with that. So what's interesting in here, as we'll add shadows, we'll go the same way, but we won't be able to go too much into the saturated. So we go the same way, darker, but not as much more saturated and closer to red. Now, less saturation in the shadow of the cold light on the skin is happening because just the red color of the blood under the skin will appear darker in the cold light, because cold light of the sky is the opposite color of the warm light of the skin. So we can't really go more saturated. Same way as we got less saturated from the sunlight skin to the skylight skin. With any material, any geometry, anything whatsoever, when we paint it in the light of the color opposite to the color of the object, this object will be less saturated. So warm skin lit by cold light makes it less saturated, and the translucency effect will also tone down its magical gradients. Also, this guy seems to be looking that way. Alright, so let's apply some of the half shading areas to add more detail to the values. Now, if you don't work in the cartoonish flat kind of style, remember to always apply the change of the brightness to every portion of the skin. Nothing should stay completely flat of just one color somewhere, because the head is round and has changes of the angle everywhere. That means everywhere you should change the brightness of the surface when it's facing the light source more or less everywhere. So the main light color will be like here and somewhere around the highlight like this. Everywhere else we should show at least a little bit of the toning down of the brightness. Alright, this seems like a good base. Now let's add even darker shadows to make it look more realistic with a better contrast. So I'm gonna grab the darker color and go even darker, even more saturated but a little bit because we're on the cold side, and even closer to red, and add more details in the shadow. What a creep. Let's add eyebrows. So, I always tend to choose any new color for the character based on whatever color there is already. So, let's grab the skin color, and I know that the hair, the eyebrows should be darker. So let's go darker, and probably less saturated darker. This seems, no, even darker. Yeah, this seems like a good hair color, generally. Let's only play a little bit with the mood. And let's go darker and less saturated for the colder side. Fixing some proportions actually worked out as I started thinking about what I'm doing, as usual. Now a few highlights for the eyes. A little rim highlight from the sky, since in here we have the skin getting darker, revealing a bit more of the surrounding reflection, same as I have on my head almost all the time. There we go. I think we're done here. So as you can see, when you pay a lot of attention to how colors change in different light sources, in different situations, we see a very interesting play of colors on the transition side from the warm light to the cold light. It looks very interesting and pleasing to the eye. And this would be quite hard and confusing to approach with the skin tone circle formula, because there's a lot of different situations you have to think about. Only working with the directions of the changes of the color depending on what kind of light source color and brightness you work with. That applies to every object with every light ever. You can paint any other object the same way as you paint skin, only adding or removing the translucency effect or making it less complicated as in the candle. Or a basic object with no translucency. In that case, we really go from light to dark like this. In this case, we kind of have the candle made out of stone or a concrete or something. It really doesn't show any translucency effect on its light to dark transition. So yeah, I'll leave you with just 3 rules for any material ever. With the skin, we go into the shadow with a more red, dark, and saturated color. With the wax, we go into the shadow with a more saturated and dark color without moving color closer to red, so only 2-dimensional change. And a concrete or anything that's not translucent at all will basically just go vertically down. Even stronger highlights from the sun are a good idea. Sun is really bright. So yeah, this is it. Hope this was helpful. I hope this example with the 2 candles and the weird guy will actually help you understand how to achieve this specific effect on basically anything you paint. You can find this PSD file on my Patreon page, link in the end of this video. Ask more questions in the comments if you have any on the subject, or if you want to know how I'm doing. And I thank you for watching if you did. I guess you did if you're here. Leave a like and subscribe, tell a friend. Think with directions. Do whatever you want. And I will see you in the next one. Bye! Also, check out my drawing to painting tutorial. I also talk a lot about how to render skin and everything.